Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. Hope you all are having a wonderful weekend. Today is August 16th, Sunday the 16th. I've recorded this intro like 5 different times because I keep messing up the date, because I'm still, now I'm like quarantining in my new Philly apartment, so it's a whole new level of quarantine. I'm like not interacting with anybody at all. So, I have no idea what day it is ever. This podcast is the only schedule that I'm on. So, if anybody is feeling the same way, I'm right there with you. But to mix things up a little bit, kind of the opposite of what's going on right now, today is a very action-packed episode. So, most of the stuff that I watched this week, both the things that I watched this week were action-heavy. And so I wanted to do kind of an action episode. I don't know if I've actually really done like a genre episode. I know I did rom-com, so that's kind of it. So I'm super excited to talk about action movies, some of my favorites. So this week, my new movie that I checked out was Project Power on Netflix. Came out this past Friday. I know, I'm on top of things. I'm kind of killing the game right now. So this is brand spanking new. So that's Project Power on Netflix. My weekly watch is actually a rewatch this time. My friend wants to rewatch, or to watch for the first time, the MCU. So we watched the Avengers, which is probably my favorite action movie of all time. So it could be my weekly recommendation. Oh my god, did you hear about how badly I just slurred those words? It could have been my weekly recommendation. Sorry, enunciation. Gotta get in the groove. So it could have been my weekly recommendation, but I watched it this week, and I know I've kind of talked about it before. I talked about the MCU at large, so I talked about the Avengers for like a couple minutes, but I want to go more in depth about it, and since I saw it recently, like I just saw it, I wanted to talk about it because I love it. So instead, my weekly recommendation is another one of my favorite action movies, and one of the most famous action movies of all time, and that's Die Hard. So probably don't need to tell you to see that if you haven't already. I just want to recommend it and reiterate what I'm sure all of culture has said forever. It's a phenomenal movie. And so the final segment, because we're doing action, is going to be my top 5 fight scenes from movies. So this is a little bit different of a list because it's not going to be specific movies. Well, it's not going to be like one movie. It's just going to be a specific fight from that movie. And I'm super excited to talk about that. So that's today's episode, and let's get started. All right, so Project Power is a brand new Netflix film released this past Friday, directed by Ariel Schulman and Henry Joost. Stars Dominique Fishback, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and Jamie Foxx. It basically follows the creation of a new drug that gives its users 5 minutes of an unknown, unlimited superpower, and it follows a cop, an ex-soldier, and a young teenager kind of on the pursuit, and they all get wrapped up in each other's storylines and on the pursuit for this drug. So, an interesting premise from the get-go. So these two directors had done Nerve a couple years ago, which was kind of met with lukewarm responses, kind of pretty underwhelming overall, but not a lot of negativity around it. I happen to kind of like Nerve. I thought it was kind of fun. Just kind of like schlocky, fun, exciting to see in theaters over the summer. This is a similar vibe, I feel like. Definitely pretty distinctly different from the like storyline. I think Nerve is a more interesting storyline. So I was curious going into this. I like both Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Jamie Foxx. Was curious of the directors, and I'll say right off the bat, I think this movie is like fine. It's not great. Ultimately, it's like fairly poor on a lot of fronts. There's a lot of like really weird, silly decisions. But it's fairly inoffensive. Like there's nothing like if it's something that you want to watch sort of with friends on a Friday, like I would totally say go for it. It's fun. But there are some places that I think the story could have gone that would have been a lot more interesting. I think it could have gone one of two routes. So I think it either could have gone the route of being a lot more reflective, taking out a lot more of like the silly moments, the somewhat comedic, quote unquote. There's like points where it tries to be comedic, but it's not really. So like take those out and make it much more of like a think piece and delve into. There's really only 3 characters that we care about or that we know even at all. And so you easily could have made it more of just focusing on those characters, make it kind of a character study and how the drug impacts them. And it would have been way more interesting. And so like focus on that or hype up sort of the silliness and just make it sort of a fun action movie. It just seems kind of confused as to which one it wants to be. And it really kind of fails pretty heavily at both. So starting kind of with the screenplay, because that's always where I like to start. Like I just said with the characters, I think what a lot of people don't like misunderstand is that you can have a really high concept movie. So this one is not super high concept, but it still is pretty creative. I think it's pretty interesting. And so a lot of people focus on that and everything comes out of the story. And so the character developments and all of the character bits sort of come from the concept as opposed to the other way around. So they really should have focused in on the characters, and then the story kind of would have built itself around that. Because I think there are some interesting like ideas with each of the characters. There's some pretty clear commentary. So like some fairly obvious messages about like poverty and the kind of role of the government with a lot of these crime-ridden, poverty-ridden areas, the sort of selling and buying of drugs in that environment, the idea of who has power. So like there's some pretty clear overt messages. And I think the one thing that rubbed me the wrong way and was sort of the most annoying is that this is a movie that it takes place in New Orleans, and the movie will not let you forget that. It is okay, little tangent for a second. Nerve kind of did the same thing, and I don't know if this is just like the directors who like to do this, but Nerve takes place in New York City, and there's a bunch of like random New York City references that don't actually build on the world or the story. It's just sort of like, hey, if you're from New York, you probably know this thing. So like they say they like talk about Wu-Tang Clan for like twice for some reason, because they're from Staten Island, and so it's sort of just kind of like, it doesn't add anything, and it's not to like enhance the world. It's just to be like, here's this little like reference. And that happens so much in this movie. Like every 5 minutes there's a reference to New Orleans. There's at least 5 Saints references, including Joseph Gordon-Levitt wearing a Saints jersey the entire movie. So like, it's sort of like New Orleans, in a lot of movies, the location should be a character. And in here, it's much more of like an aesthetic. Like it's like, we're in New Orleans, haha. It's like they picked a random city and we're just like, here's a bunch of references about it, as opposed to like building what that city is. So when I talked about the Before trilogy, like they tend to use those cities and they like go all around it and talk about the monuments, and this city kind of is less of a backdrop, and it really like influences what the characters talk about and how they're feeling. And in this, it's just sort of like, almost as if it's like the equivalent of filming on location versus a green screen. Like New Orleans is like the green screen of locations here. They're just like, here's a bunch of stuff about New Orleans because haha, we're in New Orleans. So that was my little tangent. I think it's like not a great indicator of how good the movie is, but it uses New Orleans as a backdrop, and it also uses a lot of like stereotypically like culturally black references, and like areas and things going on that kind of equate to the African American experience. So like our main character wants to be a rapper, but we don't know why she wants to be a rapper. There's no indicator that that's relevant to her character or her past. It's more of just like, we wanted to write some raps in it. We're taking place in a largely black community in New Orleans, and we're going to do rap music because of that. And the reason that I don't think that it kind of rubs me the wrong way is because doing the research as much as I could on this movie, in the time that I saw it, there doesn't really seem to be any African American black people on the production crew, and you can kind of tell when that happens that it's like using a lot of these sort of black experiences as an aesthetic as opposed to like an actual commentary on it or a critique on it or whatnot. And you can tell when it's written by a bunch of white people as opposed to people who are actually a part of that community. As far as I can tell, the only person I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe there were people who are like friends of theirs or who were consulting about it, but I really think that should reflect in the production crew ultimately. So the only one that I can pinpoint is there's a rapper named Chica, and that's it. So there's really, from what I can tell, there just doesn't seem to be an understanding of that sort of culture or experience, and it just uses both poverty and New Orleans kind of as just like a backdrop as opposed to an actual character in the story or even influencing our main characters. So then just like the story at large has fairly sloppy exposition. There's a lot of moments where the characters are sort of like, so it does this and then this happens. Oh, whoa, I didn't know that. And so it's very clearly like telling us what's happening. But at the same time, so it's telling us these rules of this drug that gives you 5 minutes of power. But at the same time, there are really no rules, which was odd to me. So you take this pill and sometimes you get a really cool power, or each person gets their own specific power. So sometimes somebody takes it and gets a really cool power. Sometimes somebody takes it and they explode. And they kind of chalk it up to being that this is sort of like experiments, like they don't know much about it and they're trying to basically get like clinical trials, off the record, off the books to see if it works, which in principle makes sense that it's like, oh, we don't understand this drug. It can do anything, but it really kind of shows its true colors as a sloppy way of like having whatever is necessary in that scene be the power that they get. So every time somebody like takes a power or a new one, it really is only influenced by like, oh, we need this character to get out of this situation, so we're going to give them this power. And there's no explanation to it. I think they probably could have come up with a good explanation, like each character's power is referencing something from their past. So like one scene in particular, there's a character that needs to get through a big door, and so he takes a pill and then he can punch through the door. So it's like, oh, we needed him to get through this one thing. Here's his power. There's a girl who at one point takes a pill and she is able to like regulate her temperature. So she's like turns to ice basically. And we get to actually see that because she's in a cage. And so it's the most relevant time for us to see a power like that. Because, oh, she's in a cage. We can see it. We can see the frost on the glass. So it really just seems like they didn't want to come up with an excuse as to why this happened. And we're just like, we don't know, but it serves our plot. So that's what we're going to do. So I thought that was a little bit sloppy too. From like an actual structural standpoint, there are a lot of plot devices that they reveal way too early. And so it completely cuts the tension of a lot of scenes. And there are some reveals that I would have liked to happen a lot later. I know that they had a bigger budget for this. This really feels like it should have been released in theaters. I think it was developed for Netflix, but it's always weird to me when there's these big action movies for Netflix. I just like, it makes me want to go see it in theaters, which I know can't happen right now, but even still. And so I know that they had a large budget, and so they kind of want to show that off. But at the same time, I think this movie would have been a lot more interesting if we're just like hearing about this drug that gives you superpowers, but then we don't see the superpowers until like way later on. And I think that would have gotten rid of that problem of having it be a plot device. Because we see a power, I think, within the first 15 minutes or so. And a lot of the powers look cool. Sometimes there's some wonky CGI, but like overall they look pretty good. And so I would have just wanted that reveal to happen later. There's also some plot devices as to who's controlling the drug, where the drug is coming from, and I think that reveal would have been a lot more interesting later on. There's some character dynamics that come up way too like late, as opposed to too early. So like character relationships that you don't understand why they're trusting each other, or don't understand why somebody believes somebody. It's like it's not giving us any reason other than the story needs to move forward. So it just seems like a lot of places the story is like, we need to be here, here, and here, everything needs to fit into that, as opposed to we're going to take these characters, they would do this in this situation, therefore the story moves here. It's like they had the story first and needed to get the characters to fit into it instead of the other way around, which tends to make a better, more interesting story. And it also just ends up being a little bit more predictable that way. So a lot of it was kind of predictable. My last little bit about the story, I know I'm mostly talking about the story here, but I just saw this last night, so it's fresh in my head. The powers don't cause any struggle, at all. Sometimes it'll kill somebody, but that's kind of quick, and it's usually a bit character who we don't care about. But the powers seem to be only a good thing. You take it and you get the power, and then you're unstoppable for 5 minutes. And I know that that's kind of the point, but the reason superheroes are so relevant and so resonant with a lot of us is not because they have these powers, because that's not relatable. What's relatable is they have this thing that happens to them, and a bunch of their struggles become heightened that way. The reason Spider-Man, for example, resonates with so many people is because he gets these powers and he still has to deal with these big bullies, or he still has to deal with paying his rent, and he doesn't have enough money, and then therefore he doesn't have enough money to fill up his web shooters, and he can't defeat the bad guys. His powers end up creating struggles for him, and that tends to happen with most superheroes that have powers. Captain America is a similar way. Wolverine is somebody who sees his power as a burden. That just tends to be what is so familiar about superheroes and superhero stories. And in this one, instead of it causing a problem and they need to get out of it that way, it just makes things easier for 5 minutes, and then the story moves on. Jamie Foxx's character, for example, thinks his power is a burden, and I would have liked that to kind of exist throughout longer of the movie. He thinks it's a burden, but you don't really see him grappling with whether or not to take it. It would have been more interesting if he needs to come out of certain situations and decides whether to take it or not as a conscious decision. And then when he does finally take his power, it's it's nothing but good. Things happen fine. He's super powerful. Everything turns out okay. So it just is kind of odd. I'll wrap up quickly about some of the other things. I think that at the very least, I think all three of our main characters are having fun. Although I think the characters are fairly poorly written, it seems like they're having fun acting. So I think their performances are a good mix of they have some great chemistry, and it's a fun mix of silliness and intensity for this kind of a movie. The side characters, on the other hand, are not all that great. Machine Gun Kelly's in this, and he's been in a lot of stuff recently, and I actually think he's a pretty good actor in this. Doesn't do his best. Casey Neistat's in this for 5 minutes, which totally takes you out of it because he's a YouTuber. And then just the bit parts in general have kind of no character to them. They're just not all that strong, I don't think. Some of the good stuff, though, I do think that the costume design is pretty distinct. It's kind of a guilty pleasure, but I like when costume designs go for things that are supposed to be looking iconic. So Joseph Gordon-Levitt wears a Saints jersey. Jamie Foxx wears a shirt that says "Adopt." So it's just sort of fun, and I like that. I think that's interesting, adds to it. The color scheme here is also kind of nice. There's some really good lighting. It kind of focuses on primary colors plus green. So it seems like a pretty simple color palette, but it doesn't happen very often. It's red, yellow, blue, and green. So it's sort of the colors that you would get in a 4-box of crayons. And so I like that. It also kind of makes it a little more vibrant because those tend to be sort of neon or much more intense, much more saturated. So I like those. I think that the music cue for the pill is really nice. It's pretty distinct. You know when it's going to happen. It tends to fit the tone of what the feeling would be maybe of taking that pill. So I like that a lot. I think the score is pretty strong too. I almost said it was a unique rock score, but later on you can tell that it's the Spider-Verse effect. It kind of sounds like the score for Spider-Verse. So it's this kind of intense rock inspired, but also kind of dubstep EDM inspired score. So, but I like it. It adds intensity. It's a good tone for this movie. I also think some of the transitions and the VFX are fun sometimes. So overall, I do think this is kind of a fun movie. I don't think it's all that good. I think it would have been a much better movie if it leaned into one or the other as a thoughtful critique or a fun schlocky action movie, and it kind of tries to do both and doesn't really succeed at either of them. So that's sort of my thoughts on this movie. I think it's fairly harmless. If you want to watch something goofy with your friends on a Friday night, check it out. Otherwise, I would skip it. I'm going to give this one a soft 5 out of 10. So kind of middle of the line, but that's Project Power. It's streaming right now on Netflix. Stay tuned for the rest of the episode where I talk about my weekly watch, which is The Avengers, my weekly recommendation of Die Hard, and the top 5 list of my top 5 fight scenes in movies. But right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my review of Project Power. I'll now be talking about my weekly watch, which is The Avengers, and then my weekly recommendation, which is Die Hard, and finally, the final segment will be my top 5 fight scenes in movies. So right now is The Avengers, which obviously I'm super excited to talk about. This is in my top 10 movies of all time. I absolutely adore this movie. I had seen it kind of early quarantine with my dad, and we had both seen it before, and so it was fun to kind of watch that after building up the hype from the beginning of Phase 1 when I did all of the MCU movies. But this watch was really fun because I was watching with my friend who has only seen a couple superhero movies, and she just kind of wants to like get an introduction to them. So she had seen like Iron Man, I think Captain Marvel, the Guardians movies, and so I decided to show her the Avengers because I personally think that the Avengers is the perfect superhero movie to show to anybody. I think it perfectly sets up the world of what superheroes are, why they're so relatable to people, why they resonate so well with people nowadays. And it's also just like perfectly palatable and fun to watch. So it's directed by Joss Whedon, stars tons and tons of people that you probably already know. And it basically follows Loki, who is trying to take over Earth through an alien attack, and the 6 superheroes that have to stop him. I know that's like a super simple plot because I'm sure everybody knows this movie and has probably already seen it, but I still wanted to talk about it because I think it's a fun one to talk about and why I think it's so good. So this one, I kind of want to start with the directing because it's gonna – I think I said this last week, but like I talk about all these things and then I move on to the directing, whereas all those things are just sort of why the directing is so good or bad. Like they're all kind of the directing, but I want to set the tone for what I think this movie is. I really think that this movie is so strong because it is really simple. Like, it basically is just bad guy, take over the world, good guys, fight with each other, and then fight with the bad guy. Like, it's so simple. And I think those stories tend to just, because they're easy to understand, I think most people can just kind of, like, have fun with it and really, really enjoy it without being bogged down by how confusing a story is. And that's not to say that sometimes confusing stories are great. I think they are. And I do think this has a lot to say. Because that's the other thing, too. I don't think simple means, like, basic a lot of the times. I think simple is just, like, here's our template. We're going to follow this, and then we're going to have fun within that template. And so maybe it's not quite as creative, but it still can create a really, really great movie. It's also just really palatable. It's funny. It's kind of the perfect encapsulation of what Marvel wants to do now and what it kind of is. There's some other later on Marvel stuff that I think is sort of the Guardians of the Galaxy effect, but this one I think really kicked things off as being a good mix of action and humor, and it really focuses strongly on character as opposed to story, something that I thought lacked from Project Power. And because you got to build the characters early on, you can focus on how these characters interact with each other, and then that builds character, so even if you haven't seen the movies before, you can understand where these characters are coming from and really relate to them and just become a big fan of these characters, and lots of people have. The other thing, too, that I wanted to bring up about directing is that Joss Whedon got his start in television, and he did a lot of television. So he did Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and that was kind of his big thing. And so he really has an understanding of what ensemble stories are like and what kind of sitcoms are like. So I know Buffy wasn't a sitcom, but it has that structure of sort of monster of the week. We're going to follow this template and you're going to end happy. So I like that he knows how to balance characters really well, and he knows how to balance character relationships really well. And he has a really good understanding of story structure, because that's kind of how TV works. You got to fit in this structure so week to week people can understand what's happening, even if they've missed an episode here or there. And that kind of creates why I think this screenplay overall is so good, because it focuses so heavily on character. And we've gotten to see, you could say 4, but I'm going to say 3, because I think the Hulk doesn't really count. They're kind of rebuilding his character in this story. But we've already seen some of those characters exist on their own, so now getting to see them interact with each other is just really exciting. I think it's taken for granted nowadays, seeing all these superheroes together, because this was kind of the first time. And I remember being like 12 years old watching this in theater, being absolutely like blown away. And I think culturally, that's what everybody was feeling. Like, it was just exciting to see all these characters team up, and that would have been enough. But the fact that it's still, these interactions are like not just fan service, but also fun and build on the story and build on the character dynamics, and everybody has their own separate arc, I think is really great. So everything comes together like that. It works like a sitcom, because they all kind of exist on their own realm and then come together in the second act, split up, and then in the third act come back together to beat the bad guy. So I like that structure is so simple, but it still works really well, and it creates some really great comedy and some really great action. It also creates some great pacing, because it's so well structured. The pacing starts off somewhat slow, because they want to build these characters, particularly the ones that we don't know as much about. And then you can have these characters interact with each other, and it's super exciting and fun. And there's like, I like here how spaced out the action scenes are. There's like a couple, you can argue the first scene is an action scene, but it's really just a bunch of stuff blowing up. Like, there's not really anything into like major. But in the first act, there's an action scene between Thor, Captain America, and Iron Man, and so that's like kind of a small one. And there's a much bigger one with everybody else on the helicarrier, and then there's an even bigger one at the very end, which is most of the third act. So it kind of splits up the story into 3 acts, and then it paces things out with a really nice escalation. So I think that's great. I had said about how the comedy, I think, is really smart. It's really just kind of quippy and clever. And I think that works really well here, because it's just a bunch of references that you can get. And having these characters be so distinctly different, it creates for some really great comedy that never feels repetitive. So all of the comedy feels like it's a unique joke for that scene or for that character. So I just think that it's just really clever and really fun. And then I also just think the third act is phenomenal. It's basically one big fight scene. So it never gets boring. It's the perfect action blockbuster. It's so fun to watch. And then it also creates some great character moments, because it's so long. You can have characters interact with ones that they may not have interacted with earlier in the movie, or they can all kind of interact with each other at later times throughout it. And then that creates some interesting character dynamics to kind of spice up the action, so then the action doesn't feel repetitive either. So all of it ends up feeling very creative and unique, because it can work so well within the confines of the structure that was already created. The characters are obviously fantastic. They're now household names. Everybody loves them. And so here, you really got a chance to build these characters. And a lot of them have kind of their own small arcs in here, which I think is really nice. And because there's so many, it's really kind of impressive that all of them have their own smaller character moments. And get to kind of understand where they're at, their psyche, and then it also is a launching point for a lot of their later stories. So I like how here we kind of see the basis for Captain America maybe being a little distrustful. Sorry, messed up that word. Distrustful of the government agency that he works for. So I like it's kind of planting the seeds in ways that are subtle. Age of Ultron kind of plants seeds in much more overt ways that kind of completely derails the story. Here they're super subtle and much more focused on character as opposed to the actual story. So I think that's really fantastic here. It plays to the strengths really of everybody's character. You get to see Captain America being a Boy Scout patriot. You get to see Tony Stark being a rebel. I like Bruce Banner being kind of this like really cautious, almost meek character for so long, and then that makes the Hulk reveal that much scarier and stronger, especially compared to his own solo outing. I think the weakest part here is Black Widow. I definitely had a problem with Black Widow early on in the MCU because I just felt like every movie that she was placed in, she was kind of a catalyst for whatever man was in the story. It always felt like she was either a love interest or somebody who just kind of played second fiddle to the guy's character development, and she doesn't really go through anything until later on. I really feel like it wasn't really until like Infinity War, Age of Ultron kind of. I really do like the idea. I thought the only character or the only like story love interest that worked for me was her and Hulk, because they both see themselves as monsters. I actually really liked that, and I liked her character development in that movie. And so it really isn't until then that she really gets her own character that's not written in response to other male characters. Here it seems like she's only kind of, they're implying a romance with Hawkeye that just doesn't, that they kind of like retconned later on. So I just don't think that her character is all that strong here. That's kind of the weak point. The strong points, Mark Ruffalo plays a phenomenal Hulk. I actually think Ed Norton is really great, but I am glad that they switched to Mark Ruffalo. I think he has a really strong difference between the voice acting for... Actually, I think Lou Ferrigno does the voice acting for Hulk, so scratch that. But I like that Bruce Banner is such a distinct character, just distinctly different from the Hulk. He sets himself apart from Ed Norton because he's a lot less confident, and he's trying to kind of keep his cool. So I think that he's really great. I also just think Loki's so strong in this. This is the one that kind of set him up as such a strong villain for later on down the road. He's both menacing, but like kind of seductive and fun to watch. So I think those are kind of the two strong suits, but obviously everybody here is doing great. I love Clark Gregg. I think he's great as Coulson. And having this be his last film outing, I think is fun. I'm sorry if I'm spoiling this movie. I'm assuming that everybody has seen it. All of these have kind of been like light spoilers, so I'll probably be spoiling. I kind of have already spoiled a lot of it. I apologize, but I don't think that ruins the movie because it is kind of a predictable structure. I think it's more about the character moments and like the fun kind of action and comedy scenes that work here. The production design here is really simple. And I actually think that works in its favor because the characters stand out really well. The characters are so colorful that having it be almost a bland-looking New York lets us focus on the characters in the like up close moments, and then even when they're on the helicarrier, it's like a very gray, sleek-looking ship, and so we get to actually focus more on the colors of the character, which I like. It's probably the weakest aspect of the movie. Something that Marvel definitely fixed later on down the road, but I don't think it takes anything away from it. I think the final battle also looks really excellent. I think the CGI is phenomenal in this. The cinematography, there are Dutch angles everywhere in this movie for some reason. If you don't know what a Dutch angle is when the camera is like slightly tilted to kind of symbolize symbolize like uneasiness, madness, something ominous, something bad might happen, and that happens a lot in this movie at some weird moments. But again, I also don't think it takes away from it, but there is some great framing here, especially in the action superhero moments. Seeing characters around each other and creating these very like splash page comic-y looking panels, I think is really awesome. The camera also works in a way that you always know where the action is, which is great. The choreography is really strong, and the camera, I think, follows the action in a really nice way. There are some moments where it's a little bit choppier, but that's, I think, just to kind of focus more on adding CGI and less stunts. But there are definitely some practical stunts in here, and I do think that you're able to follow the action in a really concise way that I can't say for all action movies. The score is iconic. The Avengers theme is absolutely like unbelievably well-timed and orchestrated and has become such a great anthem for these characters. Something that everybody finds really memorable. I also just think that one shot of the Avengers theme coming together fully for the first time and all of the characters dropping down in that pose, I gotta say, that's probably like the most iconic shot of the 2010s. Like, that kind of shaped modern day cinema, in my opinion. This is less of a strong suit for this movie. Honestly, I think that this is probably more reflective of like teams before this, but I do think that some of the teams overlapped a little bit. The sound design is awesome. The sound of like Tony Stark's arc reactor and the hammer and the shield have become kind of iconic in their own right in ways that people I feel like might not even register. So I think that works really well in this movie's favor to distinguish characters and to distinguish like their powers. So the sound design is really awesome here. There's some really good mixing as the scenes heighten, the volume heightens, and the final battle is really intense and really loud. So this is one of those movies that I really can't separate my nostalgia from like the movie itself. I do think it's a phenomenal movie. I think I probably like it better than a lot of other people just because it was such a great theater going experience for me. So I'm going to give this movie a solid to strong 10 out of 10. I absolutely adore it. I think it's the perfect superhero movie to show to anybody. So if you want to introduce somebody to the superhero genre, this one I think works perfectly. Watching it with my friend, she had a great time. Really worked well for her. It was fun to watch it kind of in my own context of knowing everything about it and then her context of knowing very little. So I really liked watching it kind of from both perspectives, and you could see how the movie kind of works both for fans and for non-fans. So this movie is awesome. Go check it out. It's on Disney Plus right now. But that is Marvel's The Avengers. Stay tuned for the rest of the episode where I talk about my weekly recommendation, which is Die Hard, and the final segment where I talk about my top 5 fight scenes of all time. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews of Project Power and the Avengers. Forgot that first one. So forgettable. And now I'll be talking about my weekly recommendation, which is one of my favorite action movies of all time. It's called Die Hard. I'm sure you guys have heard of it. It's pretty popular. This is a movie from 1988. It stars Bruce Willis, Alan Rickman, and is directed by John McTiernan. It follows New York City cop John McClane, who's on vacation in Los Angeles, as he tries to save his wife and a group of hostages from German terrorists in a kind of escape the building, escape the room plotline. So I kind of want to talk about this because I think it's honestly one of the best action movies of all time. I said at the top of the show that there are some great action movies and that I like the genre, but oftentimes I feel like I can get bogged down in stuff that I don't really like. It tends to be just kind of like a catalyst for all of these action scenes that end up feeling empty because of the fact that there's no story behind it. And Die Hard is the perfect example of how to make a very simplistic story that honestly it feels somewhat generic, somewhat basic, but really focus it around characters, which I keep emphasizing this episode, and therefore you can create compelling action that way. Because I feel like a lot of what makes action so interesting to watch is obviously choreography. is obviously skill and talent and creativity, but a lot of it is stakes. We don't really care about the fight if we don't care about the characters. And so this is something that this film does expertly. So focusing on the screenplay and the story, like I said, it's somewhat basic, somewhat simple, but I really like how it's kind of it's basically a horror movie trope. Like, I think I said that in just a second ago, but a very common horror movie idea is sort of like escape the night, like survive the night, escape the house kind of thing. Like, you just gotta get out. And there's that same thing. It's like he obviously has to do stuff, and that's the same case for a lot of horror movies, but as long as they make it to the night, more or less, they'll be fine. And so it's pretty simple, and translating that to action, I think, makes for some really interesting scenarios because you easily could make this movie into a horror movie if you wanted to, and there have been countless other, like, ripoffs of Die Hard in different ways, and some of them have been horror. So I really like how it's sort of taking this pretty common, almost exhausted horror trope and putting it into a new context, especially for like the 80s. Even then, it was kind of an exhausted horror trope. So I just like how that's sort of the idea that it's going off of. It really has a great escalation too on its basic premise, because if you just have sort of, here's this thing and we're going to do this for an hour and a half, it's not going to be very interesting. But the fact that there's a level of, like, nuance to the character motivations that we may not know right off the bat, and action scenes that get more and more intense as the stakes keep rising is really excellent. I think the movie does some really interesting things with dialogue because of the fact that John McClane kind of has this internal-external monologue, which is really nice. A lot of times monologues like this, sort of like inner thoughts, would be voiceover, and I like how he kind of just like talks to himself, and setting that up from the beginning of the movie makes it a really nice transition to when he's alone for a lot of the film, and we can kind of understand what he's going through with some of his dialogue. And they add on to that with his relationship to sort of the outside in certain scenes, but I do like how he kind of has this, we as the audience have this window into how he's feeling even when he can't bounce off of other characters in scenes. So I really like the use of dialogue here. I also think that the use of dialogue is, like, there are some absolutely iconic lines in this movie, and that's not something that's like a make or break for a film, nor is it something that's gonna like make it take off necessarily. If there are iconic lines, sometimes they can feel forced, but because the dialogue is so well written here, the lines don't stick out like a sore thumb. They just sound like pleasant. Like, they're well phrased, and I think it's just some of the most iconic movie lines almost ever. And especially for a movie like this, having scenes of levity, or at least moments of, like, levity and comedy is something that you don't oftentimes see in action movies, particularly nowadays. So I like how these really intense moments post fights or whatnot can then be sort of accented by one or two comedic lines from side characters who we end up learning a good amount about, which isn't the case for a lot of side characters, because we're really only focused on John McClane. We're kind of focused on his wife. We obviously are focused on Hans Gruber, who is an iconic film villain, played by Alan Rickman. But that's kind of it, and so we get to hear from the police officers and some of the other people outside. So I just like how all these characters are fleshed out in their own right through the dialogue. I think there's some really strong dialogue in here, which isn't always the case for action movies. And I really keep saying it this episode and every episode realistically that you gotta have your characters. And particularly, like, starting from the opening scene, we really understand John McClane as a character, and we can empathize with him. There's a really nice moment of him sitting in the front of a limo, as opposed to, like, sitting in the limo. Like, he's just kind of a guy's guy, just kind of like a dude. And so I like how that kind of translates to his everyman status throughout the rest of the movie. So whether or not we relate to his heroics, we can at least relate to his personality and his character. And so we can kind of live vicariously through him, get that sense of character. So I just think that that's a really creative way, unique way to frame a character as empathetic, particularly like an action hero like this. And speaking of him, all the characters in this movie, including him, have a really great balance between intensity and silliness. I think one thing that is missing from a lot of action movies sometimes is the level of absurdity and silliness. Like, I say silliness on this podcast a lot. Like, I think it's one of my favorite words to use because a lot of times it's seen as a negative, which I really just don't see that. I think particularly in movies, there's a suspension of disbelief, but there's also a level of like, this is crazy. It could realistically happen, sure, but it's nuts. And we, as an audience, can't relate to the situation. So there's a level of absurdity and silliness that I think has to come across on screen. And this movie has the perfect level of stakes and intensity and silliness. And a lot of that comes from the performances, where we can kind of relate to the hero or it's really like a good versus evil movie. So really like the hero, really hate the villain. And we can kind of see them in different moments of really high stakes intensity and then just sort of like silly, crazy action moments. Both Hans Gruber and John McClane serve as pretty excellent foils to each other. We really get to understand both these characters because of how often we're seeing them, and the different lines that they have. And so I really like how they bounce off each other really well, even when they're not in scenes together, which is they really only have like one or two scenes together ultimately. So I like that you can kind of get that through the cross-cutting, through the kind of juxtaposition of each scene. So even when they're not existing with each other, you get that they are kind of foils to each other, antagonists, protagonists. So they also just have absolutely insane performances. A lot of times in films like this, you wouldn't expect a performance, or you wouldn't expect like a nuanced performance. It's just sort of like, I'm going to be of service to the action, and that's all that's going to happen. And so focusing on the character and having some really excellent actors play these roles was such an excellent choice. There's also some really fantastic choreography that takes a lot of skill. So this is kind of talking about directing, even cinematography and the acting. But the choreography of the fights, whether it be actually the actors doing it or stuntmen or whatnot, is so fluid and unique. I oftentimes say that I'm not a big fan of like gun action because I think that it's not nearly as interesting when people are just kind of shooting guns at each other. But here that happens a lot. But the variety of that type, it feels a lot more intimate. So like when I kind of criticize Dread, a lot of those gunfights happen from a distance kind of. So you don't really get that sense of like severity. Even if it's like a huge explosion. And in this, a lot of the things are in close combat. And then when they're not, you can tell that they're really skillful at it. And then there are also scenes that are hand to hand. So I think there's some really fantastic variety in the fight scenes that I really like here. Given that this is kind of an escape the room movie, it's like primarily one area. And I hesitate to say location because there are definitely multiple sets, but it's one building. So I think that's an excellent way to set your movie apart for an action movie, because a lot of times there are these big scoping action movies that take place in different countries, even different continents. And so I really like here how it's one location, and so you can understand sort of like the intensity and the intimacy that these action scenes hold within the environment. And it really just makes for some interesting sets because you can kind of go from floor to floor. And so you exist in this one area, but you can really add variety in what the sets are. So it's really simple, but there's also some really memorable sets. There's also some very memorable costumes that are super simple. John McClane's like tank top, and part of that comes down to the makeup. I think there's some awesome makeup and practical effects that take hold, that show sort of on actors' faces and then actors' costumes, and it creates these iconic, memorable looks. The cinematography is also really excellent here because of the fact that it really takes from kind of film noir. So film noir is known for its intense lighting styles because it obviously couldn't use color, so it had to use shades and windows and blinds, and it used natural environments to create really unnatural but dynamic lighting styles. And there's a lot of that in this movie because he's crawling around in small spaces and he's up against windows and there are parts in the dark so he's got to sneak around. There's also some great uses of like fires and explosions that end up showing different parts of his face. There's a very memorable shot of him crawling through the air ducts with a match against his face. And that's just an example of how well done the cinematography is. The use of close-ups, I think, is really great here, because a lot of times in action movies, you're going to get mostly wide shots, and close-ups will only come when they need to hide certain things. And I like how the action is supplemented with scenes of being really up close and personal with these characters. It just adds to the stakes of the movie. One of the things that I think really, I just keep kind of reiterating, and it's what really shows what makes a good movie, is when you're kind of saying the same thing about every section of the movie, because it's all so cohesive, and there's a very clear vision, and all of that sticks out here. So here it's really just, it's simple, but it's dynamic and still creative and really intimate. And that kind of translates throughout every aspect of this movie. So you can say that within the editing, the pacing flows really nicely. The scenes that need high energy and action, it's cut really quickly, but not in a way that we don't understand where the action is taking place, because you can really like understand the choreography a lot of the times. You can see where it's happening. It's not sloppy in that way. The sound and the score is super vibrant, and it's like very symphonic. So that's kind of how scores were back when this movie was made. But it just really works here because it makes things feel more grand. It makes the stakes feel higher. And the mixing here is awesome. The sounds of the gunshots and just like how intense a lot of these scenes are works really well in tandem to these like smaller, more intimate scenes. And sometimes that can feel really jarring, but it really flows nicely here. But that's kind of it about Die Hard. It's just a fantastic movie that everything flows really nicely, and it's a focus on characters that creates great action. And the action in this is obviously phenomenal. That's why it holds up so well. Little fun fact about the movie is a little bit of a spoiler if you haven't seen it. So skip ahead about 2 minutes. But when Alan Rickman is being dropped at the very end of the movie, the cue was to drop on 3. That's sort of like what they were going to do behind the scenes. And they ended up dropping him on 2 to get a more timely like reaction. So the reaction that you're seeing in the movie is a genuine reaction to being dropped, quote unquote, too early. So I think that just shows like the time and the care that's taken into certain decisions to create the best performances and create the best movie overall. So Die Hard is absolutely fantastic. It's so cohesive. It's just great. And so I'm going to give Die Hard a soft 10 out of 10. Maybe a strong 9, because it's not necessarily like in my top 20, but it is just like that good of a movie. If you haven't seen it, you really got to check it out, especially if you're a fan of action. So that's Die Hard. Next up, stay tuned, because we're going to go into my creative venture, which is my top 5 fight scenes of all time. But right now, we're going to take our final quick break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in, I have given my reviews of Project Power, The Avengers, and Die Hard. And since it's a very action-packed episode, this final segment, I'm going to run down my top 5 action scenes, fight scenes of all time. So this is going to be fun because I don't think I've really done this yet where I'm talking about specific scenes in movies. So all of the movies that I've chosen are obviously great. I mean, barring a few exceptions, you're not going to have like an excellent fight scene in a bad movie. So obviously these are all really great movies that I really like. And mind you, these are my personal favorite. I don't necessarily think that they're the best necessarily. There's also plenty that I have not seen. I have not seen, for example, an extensive amount of like kung fu movies. So Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee, movies out of Hong Kong like that. I also just like, other than superhero movies, like I just don't go to see action movies all that much. Like specifically nowadays, I just don't find them all that interesting very often unless I like hear really good reviews about it, like John Wick, for example. But so these are just kind of like my personal favorites. I don't necessarily think that they're all the best, and I'll say why or why not. But I'd love to hear what your guys' opinion on those are. So tweet us at GSMC_movies what some of your favorite fight scenes are. I would love to hear that. But for my list, we're going to start with number 5. And number 5 is the elevator fight from Captain America, the Winter Soldier. So this is my favorite fight in the entire MCU, so don't expect the MCU coming back up. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the MCU just because it's like, I'm such a big fan of it. And I think this is just the most interesting creative fight here. The reason it's number 5 on the list is because I do think there's a lot of cuts in it, and I don't think that a lot of cuts usually translates to a very good action scene because you don't get to understand where the choreography is coming from. But because the like location of this fight is so small and so enclosed, we do actually get to see a lot of what's happening, and not a lot of the choreography is all that intricate. It's really just an exciting action scene because of how intense it is, and it really shows off the like strength of Captain America. I also really like how this movie kind of in general, I kind of gave like a runner up to the first fight scene in Winter Soldier, shows like the brutality of Captain America, and it shows how strong he is and how he can like really kind of like beat people up in ways that were not shown earlier on. So this fight scene is really brutal. It shows off the strength of Captain America. It also shows like the resilience of him. It's always fun to see one guy fighting a bunch of guys. So that's why it's number 5 on the list. That's why I think it's super fun. All right, so number 4 is another one of my favorite action. It's not really an action movie, actually. It's one of my favorite fight movies of all time. And so this is going to be the final fight between Rocky and Creed in Rocky number 1. So I actually haven't seen any other Rocky movies. Sorry. I know I'm like in Philadelphia right now, so I probably shouldn't admit to that. But I love the first Rocky. I think it's such an excellent script. And the reason I picked this fight is, again, I don't necessarily think it's one of the best fights of all time. I wanted to put a different kind of fighting style in here, so I like having boxing in this. I really like just kind of that idea. I also have not seen Raging Bull, so don't get mad at me if you think that one's better. But I wanted to put this in the list because of the fact that I keep on talking about character, and this one is so solid because we really feel the emotion. We've been spending so much time with Rocky, and that this fight is not really about Rocky versus Creed, and so we can really kind of get why there's such high stakes in this fight, and so we feel every punch as the audience. And I like the spectator camera angle. I like how we get to feel like we're watching the fight, but we also get to kind of get up close and personal with Creed and Rocky. So I picked this one because it's just so emotional, and there's so much, we're so intimate with this character, and we're so close to this character at this point. It's really a character study, this entire movie. I mean, it's the title role, Rocky, and so really getting to like feel every movement in this fight and feel like we actually are a part of it because of how we've been feeling for this entire movie with this character, I think shows how building a character and building an emotion can really elevate a fight scene in ways that the camera can't even do. So the camera is really excellent here, but I don't think that's the standout. I think it's the emotion of this fight scene. And so that's why it's number 4. And also I love Rocky. So yeah, that's why it's number 4. Number 3 is one of my favorite movies of all time. I kind of can't believe that I haven't talked about it on this podcast yet. I'm sure you saw it coming. Most people my age tend to love this movie. But my number 3 is the final fight in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. The fight between Scott and Gideon, and then Knives and kind of everybody. So I picked this fight because I felt like I had to pick one from Scott Pilgrim. The choreography and the camera and the editing in all of the fight scenes are so cool. Like, they're really well conceived. Don't get me wrong, but I think the best word to use is cool. Like, they're so stylistic and they're so cool. Like, I keep saying it. They're so stylish and cool. And so I wanted to pick one, and I think this one is like has the biggest scope. It does have the most amount of emotion. I don't think it has nearly as much emotion as Rocky does because it's more focused on the editing techniques, and having a fight scene that like has so much useful CGI. I feel like that's not always the case. So like I picked the Captain America fight because there isn't a lot of CGI in that fight. It's not a big action kind of like set piece, but a lot of times that can kind of bog things down in ways where everything feels monotonous and gray. And in Scott Pilgrim, the CGI is used in a way to make it look like a video game. And particularly in this fight, we get to see like full circle between the dance moves of Scott and Knives. I think that's a really awesome element within this fight. I also think Gideon is such a cool villain because he's like not all that menacing. He's just kind of like a dweeb. And so having Scott have to fight all of these henchmen that are much more menacing and then get to him, and it's like a sword fight, adds some cool variety between the characters where both these characters feel like they're weak in a sense, but the strength of Scott Pilgrim comes from his inner self, and that's something that's sort of like the arc of that movie. And then we get to see like physical hand-to-hand, we get to see sword fighting, and then we get a lot of cool character moments and character relationships in the fight that just kind of enhance everything. So it's just a really well conceptualized fight. I think the stunts in this are out of this world. The editing is completely unprecedented. I feel like the Edgar Wright's style is so like this. And I think Scott Pilgrim is really his crowning achievement because you get to see sort of the influences of what he had on like a lower budget and just his story, and his editing style and his very visual comedy paired with a big budget and some really awesome CGI visual effects. So that's why Scott Pilgrim vs. the World's final fight is number 3 on the list. All right, so number 2, we're coming down to some of the cool. These ones, like these next 2, I actually do think are the best fights of all time, from what I've seen. Well, I mean, all 5 of these are the best fights of all time from what I've seen, but I actually think these 2 hold up as far as like the best fights ever. So number 2 is the Crazy 88 battle from Kill Bill. So this one I feel like only adds to the Scott Pilgrim fight because of the fact that it's one person against 88 people, and it's just so cool to see. So it's like kind of a solid mix of the Scott Pilgrim fight and the Captain America fight, where it's like it has the style and sort of the silliness and like campiness of the Scott Pilgrim fight. It doesn't have that editing because of the fact that it's earlier, but there is still a lot of really intense kind of all over the place editing that really works here. So it's not as like visually compelling as Scott Pilgrim, nor is it as visually complex because of the fact that it just came out a little bit earlier and that's not the kind of movie that it's making. But the styles of this movie are so all over the place, and having all of that be incorporated with the fight and seeing how brutal the bride is, and how excellent Uma Thurman is with like all of her movements and choreography, and showing how she can like take all of these people. And so it kind of like is a really nice homage to kind of 70s action flicks and kung fu flicks. And so having all of that paired with the Quentin Tarantino style, the really intense dynamic lighting here, I honestly think that the bride's outfit in this is probably one of my favorite film costumes of all time. And so having all of that paired together to create really just this excellent high stakes, campy but still intense fight scene with some like really cool choreography and sword work makes it one of my favorites and one of the best. All right, and now we're on to number 1. This is my favorite fight of all time. I think it is one of the best fights of all time. I think it's extremely influential, and I don't think it gets talked about enough. And this is the hallway fight scene from Oldboy. So Oldboy is a Korean film, I think from 2003, and it's a really disturbing, messed up film. I think it's amazing, but hard to watch, difficult to watch. And this fight scene, I think, really encapsulates everything in this entire list. So it has sort of like the brutality and the strength of the Captain America scene. It has all of the emotion of that Rocky scene even earlier in the movie. It has the style of the Scott Pilgrim fight, or it's not the style of the Scott Pilgrim fight, but it still is a style. It's mainly one take, so it's this visual style of kind of going left to right, and seeing all of the choreography without any cuts. So it still has like a really intense style to it, and then it also has like the craziness of having him to fight so many people in this. And then I think the things that it really brings to the table, I said the one take, a fight scene I think is infinitely more impressive and interesting to watch when you actually see all of the choreography without any or minimal cuts. And it's also really cool here how we get one angle, and it's not really a close-up angle. We get to actually see the entire fight, but because of how well framed it is, we still get to see like how our main character's reacting to the fight at hand. And then I think the thing that's most interesting about this fight that it's kind of unique that it brings compared to the rest of this list, Rocky does this somewhat, but I think that's sort of just the nature of that kind of a movie, is we actually get to see the weaknesses of all the characters, as well as sort of the fatigue. Like a lot of these fight scenes feels like the character is completely unstoppable, and like invincible and never gets tired. But in this one, he still continues and finishes the fight, but the entire time he's like falling down and tired, and it's sloppy because real fights are not well choreographed. They're sloppy in real life most of the time. And so this kind of adds all of that to it and is still visually interesting to watch and very emotional. And the other thing that's really cool is that this one pretty overtly inspired the Daredevil fight scene from the first season that I wanted to put on the list, but it was a TV show from that season 1 of Daredevil that got so much recognition, so much praise, and Oldboy is sort of the main kind of contributor to that fight scene, and Oldboy just did it so well. There's also a great integration of weaponry combat as well as hand-to-hand combat. I just think that this fight is so well done, so well directed, acted, like everything about this fight scene comes together in some really excellent visual ways. But that's number 1. That's the Oldboy fight. So that's the list. I hope you guys like this list. It was kind of fun to put together. It was cool to revisit the fight scenes. I think fight scenes are one of my favorite things from movies, whether or not it's an action movie. I just like seeing the cool choreography and the stunt work, and it's just obviously like very cathartic to see people punching each other. So I just think it was a cool list to put together, and I really enjoyed it. So that's the episode. I hope that you liked it. I don't know if you guys noticed, I'm trying to kind of integrate a different sort of style to this podcast. I still want to keep my reviewing techniques of sort of the stuff that I talk about, but I want to make this a little bit more casual. I tend to watch the movies only a couple days before I record, and so a lot of the intricacies and the nuances of certain performances and certain aspects of the film I don't really get to understand because I don't get to rewatch it, or I don't get to do as much research. So if it's not kind of apparent on first viewing, I don't necessarily get to reiterate it to you guys and maybe appreciate the film as much as I should. And I want to give a film its due credit because there's so much work that gets put into these movies, and so I want to be able to do that. So I want to keep talking about things, and I want to be critical, and I will obviously talk about a lot of the stuff that I talk about kind of on this show already, but I kind of want to make it more casual and just talk about some of my thoughts on the film. I mean, I've been doing this podcast now for a month or two, and I think you guys have a good understanding, hopefully, of what I like in movies, and whether or not you agree with my opinions. And so hopefully how I'm feeling about certain movies, focusing mostly on story and character a lot of the times, will give you a good sense of whether or not you'll like the movie, and I can still kind of tell you if I recommend it or not. So that's kind of the direction I want the show to go. It'll be kind of slower, I think, in figuring out how that's going to sound. I'm still getting accustomed to what the style of this show is going to be for me. And so if you guys prefer the more critical, more structured way of reviewing, let me know. Or if you like the more casual idea, just kind of talking about the movie, let me know that as well. Tweet at GSMC_movies. I really like to hear your opinion. I want to check that out, see what you guys are thinking about the podcast. Hopefully you guys are liking it. I still love doing this for you guys. I really like watching these movies and talking about them. So I really hope that you're enjoying this podcast as much as I am. So as always, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review because that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I've been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you, and have a good one.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.